Welcome back to The Short Game. This is a show about short video games, games that respect your time. I'm Reagan Kelly, and I'm joined by my awesome co-host, Laura Nash. How are you doing, Laura?
I'm doing great. It's not snowing today in Chicago for once.
Shocking. Well, actually, it is snowing again here in Denver, which sucks. It's been on and off for... I don't even want to talk about it. But we are joined this week by a guest, which is very exciting for our show, Patrick Klepek. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us on this show. I hope I can give you a proper introduction, but Patrick is the senior reporter for Waypoint, Vice's Waypoint, which is a really fantastic video game culture site. He also hosts is one of the hosts of the Waypoint radio podcast. And we wanted to have him on because he wrote an extremely interesting to us article with the incredibly true title, Most Video Games Are Too Long. It was so on brand that I literally have, for our show, postcards that we handed out the first year we got started as a show that have the words, most video games are too long on there, like on our postcard. So when I saw that, I was like, I want to talk to Patrick about this. So, Patrick, thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I can report from the suburbs of Chicago that it is also not snowing, which is good.
So we wanted to have you on, like I said, because you'd recently written an article for Waypoint. It was a really short article. Seemed like the kind of thing that you...
tossed together at the last second because you had to put something together and I don't know, I'll just write this piece and I'll put it up there and see how it does. If that's what you were thinking, then let's just say you're close.
I believe you said 20 minutes at some point on Twitter. I was like, deadline. Gotta get the content up.
I spend a lot more time on pieces that I hope to get reactions to, and I don't. And then I spend 20 minutes on a piece, and you fall on a good headline, and then there's thousands of people want to read it. Yeah, the internet is a fickle thing.
A very strange thing. So the article was, most video games are too long, and that obviously hits really close to this show's heart. Our whole thing is talking about short video games. This is a drum that we've been beating for about 4 years now. And it's just, there's a different response to video game length just sort of as an idea than there used to be. Obviously, you wrote this while you were playing the game that we reviewed last week, Minute. But what prompted this article specifically? Tell me a little bit about where this came from.
Well, I played Minute sort of as a palate cleanser from the game I just reviewed for Waypoint, God of War, which is not a short game by any stretch. If you just do the main storyline in God of War, it's at least 20 hours, and if you're doing all the side stuff, you add another 10 to 15. If you're a completionist, you're looking at 50 to 60, and so that is on the complete opposite end of Minute. And I had reviewed that, which means I was just spending a lot of time with that game and thinking about length, and even that's a game that has some pacing issues in the back half, but doesn't feel overstuffed narratively. It feels like a game that, for the most part, uses its length appropriately. And so when I was thinking about that relative to Minute, and then thinking about those games kind of in parallel and in contrast to one another, and then all of that in the context of a God of War, a game that is about fatherhood and toxic masculinity, and my own experiences being a father, which hopefully do not involve toxic masculinity. You can ask my daughter later, I guess, to get the evidence. But I was kind of mixing all those things together, and it's certainly been posited before that the video games are too long, and so I wanted to come at the angle that was, even though I was starting to think about it because I'm a father and my free time is limited, that was less of what I was getting at. More of it was that I think a lot of video game fans use length of time to play a game as a value metric, and as in a response, game developers tend to try and make longer games because that's something that video game players value, talk about. Any review will mention how long a game it takes to play. It's as opposed to movie review, where it's just kind of a thing on the side like release date, movie length. It's just a bullet point. It's a piece of data. It's actually like a value proposition with video games. And so, yeah, that's kind of where that came from, was trying to sort of wrestle with that idea and what does that say about video game fans? What does that say about critics and reviewers who have it's become just sort of indoctrinated. That's something you need to talk about because people are going to ask you about it if you don't talk about it, and sort of where all that stuff falls, especially in the sort of the idea that if you work on a game for a number of years, I have lots of friends that are game developers. I've interviewed countless game developers, and things become very precious as stuff goes along. If you were to work on something for 3 years, even if it would be better for the story, the experience, for that thing you've worked on for 3 years to disappear, like that's a lot easier for me to say who experiences the thing at the end and then can more easily identify, wow, that like 2-hour stretch was bad for pacing. Rip out those hundreds of hours that animators and designers and programmers worked on. So I was kind of jumbling all those things together. And then actually tried to temper what I was saying because it felt like it would have been more hyperbolic to say video games are too long. Like that actually might be, like that might actually be true. But I think it's more that most video games are too long because most video games are either using time as I think as a invalid form of value, and then also finding a way to kill your darlings is a difficult proposition for probably any creator.
Yeah, it's interesting take because I've been reading a lot about prestige TV having similar problems where longer episodes are seen as fancier. It's a premiere that's 70 minutes long. It's got to be a more important, more dramatic, more interesting piece, where it's not true for movies, but it is for individual episodes. And it's funny because in games, I'm not sure if we have a prestige attachment to a longer game versus a short game, because some short games are seen as so experimental and philosophical and different, but it is seen as kind of a, am I wasting my money value?
Right. Yeah, and I it's not something I went into this particular piece, but like the value judgment, the financial aspect of this, like I 100% get as a teenager that had precious little money to spend on games. Like part of the reason I was attracted to JRPGs was that I could spend. In Final Fantasy VII, I maxed out the clock to 999999. That both says something about my social life, and then also like the fact that like Final Fantasy VII could fill that much time. Like I was grinding to get like Knights of the Round Table and doing all the side stuff and trying to fight Ruby and Emerald and blah blah blah, and like that I enjoyed the fact that there was always something more to do, and I understand the attraction to worlds that you like spending time in and you'd like to do more in them, even if you know in your heart of hearts that like this isn't really a satisfying thing to do in the world. You just want to do more things in that world. But I think all these things kind of push and pull at each other in a way that video games largely like as a medium could like use an editing tool because I think the games, the experiences, the stories would be better for it, even if that's like telling someone we're going to take an hour away from this thing you paid $60 for. It's like, well, that's not really what they're doing. They're trying to tell a better story, or take out something that was tedious or repetitive. If you go read how films are made, like when they stitch together the dailies and like put together a rough cut, I think like Black Panther was 4.5 hours. Now, okay, would I like to see the 4.5 hour cut as sort of like as a fan who's like interested? But I'm also glad that like there was someone there to make the tough choices. I'm like, well, this is actually what the story needs in order for it to be told. And there just seems to be a little bit less of that in video games.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about that is that I tend to think about video game length mostly from the player side. And my perspective on it, I mean, yes, I certainly totally understand the argument of like, I want a nice, long, juicy game because I'm going to spend $60 on this. I want to spend half my life playing it. I get that, and I do understand that sort of value proposition. But I also, part of this is because I've grown up, gotten a job, all the stuff that means that I have more money, less time, and so my right. my value proposition has totally flipped. But I certainly remember putting hundreds of hours into Phantasy Star 4 that I got for $18 at a Blockbuster used, and it's like that was a great value proposition for Kid Reagan. But it's interesting to talk about that stuff from the production side too. Like I think about this stuff mostly from like, okay, how do I value my time, and how do I choose? When I make choices about games, am I choosing to play long games or short games? How do I make those choices? But it's interesting to think about it from the producing side as well, thinking about it in terms of editing and not maybe you want to cut that scene that really could be cut, but but Joe worked on that so hard. That's an interesting kind of side of it.
I do user experience design for a living, and no one's ever gotten promoted for cutting a feature.
Yeah.
It's a hard sell because you have to tell people that you wasted money. And it'll make it better, but it's just a much more political thing. Even if you're at a small studio, it's a personal thing. At a large studio, it's much more about a political, someone's job is going to be on the line because you wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars on something that was a failure. Even if it tested poorly, it's just people hate pulling features. So
that makes a lot of sense. And there was this piece I wrote for Kotaku years back. And that was the first piece I wrote for the site that was headline something about, like, I wish Dragon Age Inquisition had more respect for my time. And I can't speak to that game's production or how it was made, but you got the sense playing it that they built all these big, beautiful worlds for you to explore, and then just didn't have either the resources or didn't, whatever the case, what they filled the world with outside of the main story stuff was just fairly tedious and boring and uninteresting, and did not justify the beautiful world and art that had surrounded it. And I kept thinking, it's BioWare. If they're going to put something into it, it's gonna be because there's a good story to be told. There's gonna be something interesting to be found. Even if the side quest starts not particularly well, maybe it's gonna go somewhere or hit me from a different angle. And I just found over and over in Inquisition that was not the case. And it seemed very much that they built these big spaces and then felt that's because what players want. They want open worlds. And it's okay. I mean, maybe players say they want open worlds, but if you're not there to justify the open world part of it, well, then maybe it should have been a third of the space, so it could have been denser and more compact, and players actually knew what they should be spending their time on. I think The Witcher 3, which is still an extraordinarily long game, and the main storyline probably could have been shaved by 7 or 8 hours, but the world, one of the things that The Witcher 3 does that Dragon Age Inquisition didn't do very well was that it very clearly delineates in the map between what's just the grindy side stuff that you don't actually need to spend your time with, but maybe is worth doing early in the game to get your stats up and stuff like that. But if you're just trying to do the meaningful side quests, we're gonna gatepost that for you. We're gonna let you know this is worth your time. And I found more often than not that in The Witcher 3 I was rewarded for tracking that stuff down, and I'm not sure enough games give that enough consideration, where even if you're going to put in glut and filler because you need to put enough stuff in this world to justify its size, it's find some way to communicate to players the hierarchy of what their interest should be in that, rather than having to find out for themselves 10 hours later, actually I didn't need to spend any time with this. This is just here to fill the gaps in the world.
So you mentioned that you wrote an article sort of like this same concept, essentially almost 10 years ago or something for Kotaku. Well, I don't know how long ago that was for Kotaku. You've been writing for a long
10 years
time.
ago. It was probably 3, but who's counting?
Right. That game came out a while ago, and this is not a new conversation in video games. This is a totally uncontroversial, totally basic thing to talk about any other film. No one's going to flame a critic for saying that a film was too long, but we have a kind of a different relationship with length when it comes to the press talking about this concept. You get kind of weird reactions, and I see it from my side, but I'm kind of wondering, is this a conversation that has moved forward in any way? Is this something that you feel has changed over time in your career in the gaming press, or are we just still having the same conversation again and again?
Well, I think in some ways it has changed. I think you're seeing a lot. It used to be the case that the vast majority of game critics were in their 20s, weren't parents, and I think we're seeing a lot more folks stick around in games writing and games criticism, both because there are more voices, right? So it's not even just established sort of critics and journalists like myself that have been in sort of salaried, traditional job type roles. I think you're seeing a lot of folks that, through the democratization of speech through the internet, where they can run a blog and they can post on Reddit, and there are different ways for critique to kind of make its way through. So I think we're getting a wider variety of voices, which means a wider variety of where people are at in their lives, what their responsibilities are. So, I can only speak to my own experience, and part of that is as a father and with limited free time, you try to pick your bat. Like, I don't watch nearly as much garbage TV as I used to, and I love garbage TV. Mm-hmm. Like, it's now just I just watch garbage horror movies. Like, that's the one thing I can't give up, because my wife and I sort of like met over that stuff, and like that's like our thing. But like, like, yo, Iron Fist seems bad, I'm just not gonna watch it. But like 5 years ago, I'm like, who cares if Iron Fist is bad? I got 12 beers here on a Saturday afternoon to kill, and like we'll go through it. And so there is that part of it. And I think the thing that players do have a point about, and something I wrestle with, and every critic wrestles with this, is that you never, it's very difficult to have the same experience playing a game as a critic than the player is going to have. You are playing it in a very compressed time period. With God of War, had I not had PAX East sort of intercede, I actually would have had like almost a full 2 weeks to, work through 25, 30 hours, which is faster than I would still normally play a game like that, but is like still fairly reasonable for someone that was like making gaming their primary hobby, playing a couple hours each night. That's not totally out of their own possibility to make it through that in 2 weeks and finish that game. That's just not the case for a lot of games, though. A lot of games you're getting code for a 12, 15-hour game, 48 hours, 12, a day before release, maybe a couple of days, a weekend before, and the embargo is on Monday morning, which means you start playing it on Friday and then have to somehow come up with thoughts by Sunday night, and it has to be edited, laid out, blah, blah, blah. And all the time you're trying to put into consideration that your experience is different than the vast majority of the audience who is going to engage with it. And for me, I've always just tried to be, or at least what I've learned over the years, is rather than I do as much as I can to have whatever could be considered a sort of a normative experience, but for whatever falls outside of that, just speak to how it wasn't. Like, I'd rather just be honest with the audience, and they know where I'm coming from, how I played the game, and if they want to take that into consideration for how they interpret my own reaction or own critique, then I think that's a fair game. Because I think it's impossible to say it doesn't have an influence, but it's also impossible to say what that influence is. Because I think it's both true that games are generally speaking, too long. And it's also true that the manner in which a lot of critics are forced to play games in order to do the rat race of like publishing a game so it can have the highest sort of like traffic potential does mean they play it in a way that could exasperate the tediousness of a game if you weren't playing it in such a compressed manner. So I think it's true, but also it's a difficult problem to grapple with, because we don't live in an age when magazines used to be around. They would get the games, a full like 2 months in advance, and that's a long time to play a game and to work your way through it. And so there was less of an issue with that because you were getting it further in advance, and also games were just finished earlier. Like the way games are made now, games are made right up until just before they ship, and then even after they ship, they're working on a day one patch to get that stuff finished in the 2 weeks in between, like it being sent to production and it arrives on shelves. So it's just the nature of all that stuff has changed, and it makes it complicated. So I guess the long story short, I just try and be honest with folks and speak to my own experience. And then if they think, oh, I think that reaction he had is because of how he played it, or because he's a dad and I'm not a dad, so that's not going to bother me. That's more power to you.
When you're looking for reviews for Waypoint, are you kind of curating palate cleanser games like Minute in the mix to try to keep you guys from the reviewer burnout? Or is it just a happy accident when something short like Minute comes in the mix and gives you a chance to review something different?
It's like a mixture of both. We're relatively new to doing reviews. It's something that Austin and I, when we first started Waypoint, we said, we're not doing reviews. And then what we found was that what we were largely doing was like maybe, a couple days after a game or a week later, we were writing like these long essays that were more or less reviews, but like we were calling them essays or critiques or whatever. And there was just something about the word review that just has a certain authority and weight, and like very honestly, like traffic wise, like there was stamping a review on it just means something different in terms of how people pay attention to it. And so we thought, like, well, what if we rethought that? What if instead of it was the critical essay a week later, what if it was a review, and we just treat our reviews as it's not any different. Maybe we're we speak a little more generally or wider scope about a game and explain a little bit more of the mechanics and the basics to like get people up to speed if they're maybe reading Waypoint for the first time or encountering the game for the first time, and doing less sort of assumption of knowledge about someone coming into a piece. But let's try and weave like those critiques into an actual review, because that got it to the heart of one of the things that Austin and I talked about as we were putting together the site, was trying to make a publication that reflected what we wanted to do more of every day rather than an outlier at publications that we had both worked at previously. And so it's like, if we want to, rather than writing a review and then an essay that talks about the politics of a game, like what if that's just the thing? And so, you read, Austin's review of Far Cry 5, like very much weaves in his analysis of the game's political commentary or lack thereof. And I, my piece talks about like, the God of War's like, history with violence and things like that. And, it's the sort of datification of games and like putting that all in there as opposed to its own separate piece. And so it's also just a thing where we sort of let people review what they want. Like we're such a small staff at Waypoint that we can't really cover everything. So in order to ensure that there is as little staff burnout as possible, it's really trying to encourage people to find a balance between, we should cover this because it's a big thing and people are probably interested in what we have to say. And then also, like, well, if you're tired of those games and you don't want to put in the hours in it and what you're going to have to say about it won't end up being interesting, well, then maybe that's just not the best use of our time. So, yeah, it's kind of a balance between all those things. Like, Danielle loves tiny, weird indie games. And so, like, she's going to review a lot of tiny, weird indie games, and that's just fine.
Well, she has been a great resource for this show. We
I bet, yeah, I bet.
Does coverage of shorter games do okay on your site, like just in terms of traffic? Obviously there's this marketing and just cultural moment behind big AAA game releases that has got to make those reviews, probably the bread and butter of a site like Waypoint. But you have this different sort of way of having a take on games that's not just about reviewing them as commercial products. You're talking about them as cultural things. When you do these reviews of smaller games, do you have an audience for that?
I mean, if your question is like, could Waypoint exist if we only covered like those indie games? Like the answer to that is no. Like that stuff doesn't. Occasionally, a thing hits in a way that is surprising, but it's not something that can be relied on because, frankly, like the smaller audience for that, like only a fraction of the audience is interested in even a big game is going to click on your piece about it. And then if you are to shave the potential audience down to a smaller game to, a fraction of that, the same, logic applies. And only a fraction of those people are going to click on your piece about that. And so, I think, we part of Waypoint is championing, smaller, independent, marginalized, strange, odd things. And so it is always going to be core to our mission that is the kind of things that are showing up on our front page regularly, that we're putting resources into covering those, reviewing those, treating them as though they are the same, like cultural objects on the same level as a God of War. We don't think of them as like bigger or smaller. We just think of them both as a thing that we're interested in. Let's talk about how we react to it. Because if we were to lose that entirely, it's, it would lose part of the core DNA of like what Waypoint is, which was like both highlighting marginalized voices in game creation and in game critique and game analysis. Like that is really woven into the whole what Austin wanted to do and what I signed on to try and help him accomplish was to do that at Waypoint. And so yeah, like the small stuff doesn't do particularly good traffic. That's not exclusive, but that is tends to be the thing. But and on the flip side of that is figuring out, I think we tended to shy away in the first year from actually covering a lot of the big AAA stuff because our thought was that's being done maybe not just fine, but plenty by everyone else, and maybe our focus should be elsewhere. And then what we kind of started, our thinking sort of evolve, and certainly like sort of like business considerations go hand in hand, but we also were like, did it make sense to abandon those games from like our analysis, our critique, just because we find them less maybe interesting, like a foundationally. And it's like, no, like there's a reason that like so many people buy these games, are interested in these games. Like, what if we try to sort of set our egos aside a little bit? And like, what if we were to take the same thoughts and feelings about examining them as cultural objects, as political objects, and apply that lens to like big games like God of War, Far Cry 5, Detroit Become Human, stuff like that. And we have found that to be not only useful in terms of like running a successful website, but also like people want to know how to feel about those games. Like one of the values of a critic that I learned over the years, is not something I really thought about when I got started, was trying to find a way to give people the words to explain how they feel about something. I think a lot of people will. This is definitely true for me when I watch like TV and movie where I don't have a lot of the language. Like that's not what I'm versed in criticism. And I love reading like really thoughtful essays because I'll read something and go, right, that is exactly how I felt, but I had no way of, I fumbled that out, like I had no way of really expressing it, and someone else does it beautifully, and then I'm able to like point like, hey, this is why I felt this way about this thing, and we find it useful to do that in games criticism, and I found it increasingly useful to start doing that in like the larger game space, like God of War and Far Cry 5. And I think that's something we're hoping to continue going forward, because the response has been really positive for folks that like they're really interested in politics and stuff like that, but they're also like interested in these big ass video games that yeah. That I think have largely been treated like they have nothing to say or don't even have a political context, and that's both wrong, and it's largely thought to be that way because they haven't been treated as such. And so, however we can chip away at that block, I think we find to be useful.
While you're trying to dig into both those similar depth, do you look for different things in shorter games versus longer ones, or AAA versus indie when you're deciding what to cover?
I mean, I think it's often the same as what I said before about like what kind of what speaks to us, right? Like it's that can be like in Minute, that's like mechanically, right? Like that is like the gimmick of the game, the framework of the game is really fascinating, where you're playing through a session every 60 seconds. Like I think you'll often find a lot of the games that we're covering, especially in that space, tend to have like a real sort of emotional depth, like often dealing with sort of like gender and sex. So like specifically, like there's a lot of stuff that we publish on Waypoint, both written by our staff and stuff that's done externally by our great list of contributors. Like that, yeah, specifically deals with things like sex and gender and identity, because you just don't see a lot of that in other publications. And like the notion that games aren't grappling with that or trying to grapple with it is false. But you do see that a lot more explicitly in indie games. So I think you end up seeing a lot of that stuff filter into Waypoint's coverage, where it's like, we want to talk about these topics. And while it's starting to happen a little bit more in the larger games, like where you're seeing it happen much more rapidly, much more interestingly often is in the smaller games. So it's like as we look for different ways to expand on those issues, and the indie space ends up in these often shorter games end up providing like a really good outlet for those discussions.
And because our listeners are always looking for what are good short games to play, and I guess also because we're always looking for what to cover on the next episode. Do you have any particular short games that you've played maybe over the last few years that you think maybe didn't get enough attention or that you really enjoyed?
I feel like anyone that I put out there, I feel like you're probably going to have already covered on this podcast. So.
It's fine. We always like plus ones. So
so there were two this year that I really enjoyed. The shortest of the short was this iOS romance game called Florence that came out, I think, in January or February. It's just a really interesting, more graphic novel than like mechanically driven game that tells just a pretty ordinary story of like a relationship it's not about saving the world. It's not even about like a relationship like crashing and burning. It's more just like a very sympathetic, interesting, relatable story about like two adults and like stuff that happens as you like figure out romance. And it's on iOS and Android at the moment, and it's only a couple of bucks, and it takes like, I don't know, half an hour to play, like the equivalent of like a 22-minute episode of a TV show. And then the other one from earlier this year, Gorogoa, which is a puzzle game that was on Switch and PC, and I think it's coming to PS4 pretty soon. I know they're porting it to some of the consoles right now, but just a really wonderful puzzle game, whose story I tried to follow, but I was mostly just engulfed in the puzzles. But it's a really, really well made and only a couple of hours long. And it's actually a game I would recommend if you do some the GDC talk that the designer did. He worked on this game for, I think, the better part of 7 or 8 years. And very specifically, he spoke about like a lot of the development of that game was doing the very thing that I was advocating for and talking about, which is like killing your darlings and removing things from the game because it made the game better. And he does a whole talk at GDC, which I think just went up on YouTube, which he speaks to like what it was like and how to find the things to cut. I think he said he like cut like 2 or 3 games worth of like finished content because it didn't serve the game he was trying to make. And that's like I imagine a very brave thing to do given how much time he must have spent building all that stuff out.
Yeah, that was a magnificently put together game, and you're right, really exquisitely edited. So I'm definitely going to go check out that GDC talk if I can find it. We'll have a link in the show notes. And this is a relatively new segment to our show, but as we have been doing for the last few episodes, we are going to close it out with non-short game chatter. What is making you happy this week? So name for this segment is pending. Listeners, if you have a suggestion on what we should be calling it, rather than simply stealing the name from the Slate Gabfest, was it the show that we stole it from?
And Pop Culture Happy Hour. We're stealing it from everybody, basically.
Yes, that's the one. And also, of course, from the excellent Waypoint Radio, where they have come up with a cute name for theirs, which is just Waypoints. Laura, do you have anything that's been making you happy this week?
I've had a bad fever this week and have been delaying watching Westworld because I'm afraid I won't be able to follow it. But I was able to catch up on a show called Killing Eve, which is on BBC America. There's only 3 episodes out right now. It's got Sandra Oh, and it's this cat and mouse assassin game where there's a female MI5 detective and a female assassin, and they're kind of trying to track down, one is killing people, the other one's very obsessed with female assassins. But it's weirdly funny. The first episode, when you meet this person, everybody is super hungover, and there's episodes where you're trying to eat a croissant during a meeting. Stuff like that doesn't normally get into the high-class spy procedurals. These people are human, and they're really weird. And I think it's, I'd love to know what it's like when I'm not on Dayquil, but so far I've seen 2 episodes, and they've both been top-notch. Everybody's a good actor, and it's a much more interesting version of a show that I thought I had seen before.
Awesome. I can't wait to check that out. The thing that's been making me happiest this week is that I finally bought and installed a Lutron Caseta switch in my living room, which is one of the home automation, Alexa enabled smart switches.
Okay, all right.
And so I've started going down that I feel extremely old, and I don't know. Patrick, you've become a dad. Has the home automation thing gotten?
I started. My lovely in-laws, when they asked, like, they, since we've had our daughter, like, we've basically, like, hey, if people want to stop buying us gifts, like, we're good, like, just buy stuff for our daughter and spend money on her. But my in-laws were very insistent, like, what is something that you'd like to buy yourself, but, like, you just won't, like, you cannot justify it. And I was like, wow, man, I really want to start going down the path of, like, replacing the lights in the house over, like, the next, like, couple of years, and let's, like, when things are on sale, buy, but it's like the starter kit is like the most expensive part of that. And it's not like ridiculous expensive, but it's like $150. Like, it's enough that, like, I'm not sitting on Amazon going like impulse buy $150. Like, that's just not it. And for Christmas, they got me, like, the starter, like a Philips Hue pack, like, not the colored ones. I haven't gone down that rabbit hole, just the regular white ones, but I was able to replace, like, all the ones in the kitchen and the ones in our living room, which is, like, where our daughter is and where we go in at night to, like, grab things. And, like, so it's, like, the most useful part of the house to have those lights. And it is awesome to, like, not have to touch those switches, that if it's cloudy out that day and I just need all the lights in the immediate area just to, like, pop up, like that. Yeah, I'm with you. It's really good. And, like, we put in a Google Home in our kitchen so I can just, like, yell at that. Of course, now all my daughter says is, okay, Google, Go. Because she's gonna ask it like animal noises, and so it's like, what does the monkey sound like? And then she laughs at the monkey sound, but then just sits there going, go, and she can't say it yet, which is good, but I'm sure in the next 6 months that'll change.
Wow, yeah.
There's a writer, Catherine Van Arendonk, who thinks her baby has imprinted on the Alexa because one day it was down and the lights were blue, it was red, and the baby was so upset and kept like hitting it, and she's like, oh no, my baby thinks Alexa's alive
and now it's dead. So, oh god.
Yeah, it really upset the baby when Alexa was down. So now she's kids in tech are fierce loyalty bonds. Who knew?
Well, that's basically where I'm at though with the Lutron Caseta wall switch. I managed to install it without electrocuting myself to death. And so I heartily endorse the Switch. It's easy if it's having them built into the Switch rather than into the bulb is nice, because then you still have the option to go hit a switch on the wall, and you don't get that situation where you've got maybe like the bulb is turned off but the switch is turned on. Things get kind of confusing that way.
Yeah, it's a little weird on ours where like sometimes they'll like lose connection over Bluetooth and then like one light goes out, but then if you go to turn the switch off, you're turning like all the light.
Yeah,
it's finicky, but I can yell at a device and it turns my lights on and off, and that's pretty all right.
It's something I want. I just happen to live in a 1-bedroom rented apartment, and the Switch is always within 4 steps of me, so I really have no need for it yet.
Neither do I, and yet here I am.
Yes. Well, Patrick, do you have anything that's been making you happy this week outside of games or short games? I
am happy that I have not been spoiled on Infinity War yet. A movie I'm tremendously excited for. And I guess like on top of that, I'm surprised how little. I'm happy that I don't know what's going to happen when I go see that movie like tomorrow night, whenever. I don't know when this is going up, but I'm recording this 2 nights before it comes out. And my wife and I have we're all set up. We're going to go see the movie. We're seeing a movie theater that serves alcohol, so we have some beers while we're watching it. And I've been tremendously invested in that whole world. I've gotten into comics like largely because of the MCU, and it's like exciting to go into it. And we're like, are they going to kill these characters? Like, which is like a really funny existential thing to think about, because like the only reason that's a thing is because they don't ever kill those characters. like it's an indictment of fiction and like film in general that people are like, I wonder if they would kill someone when like. That's just like a thing fiction should do. If that's the story it should tell. But it's exciting to think like there's so much writing on this, and I largely don't know what's going to happen. And so I'm just excited that I don't know, and maybe it'll be disappointment on the other side. But there are a few things in life, especially as someone that writes and like sees things early for a living, like that I'm able to go in with like a sense of mystery and surprise. And so however it pans out, I'm excited about not knowing. And that like actually itself makes me happy.
I'm hoping I'm still in that same place, 2 weeks from now when I finally make it down to a movie theater or drag my wife down to a movie theater.
See, I'm on Twitter too much, so like because it's part of my job, and so I just when it becomes like these big cultural moments like this, like it's Star Wars.
And once the embargo's lifted, it's just terrifying. Right. It's horrifying being on.
And on top of that, there is a history of folks like. I've already turned on my notifications on Twitter from people. I normally like just let the Twitter stream flow like a gross river, like a swamp. But then I need to turn off the notifications or anything other than people I follow, because like folks that don't like my work and folks from like Gamergate and stuff like that will like seek out and try and spoil things for me just to like mess with me, which happened with me with The Force Awakens.
Oh,
like,
that sucks.
Like 10 minutes before I walked in to see the movie, like which. Not great. So far, knock on wood, I'm doing all right. So we'll see.
Well, best of luck. I hope that holds out.
Thank you. I just jinxed myself. I shouldn't have said any of this out loud.
It's okay. It won't go up until afterwards. So hopefully no one will know.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been really fun chatting with you. I just for our listeners, if any of you haven't already been, first of all. Check out Waypoint, waypoint.vice.com. It's a fantastic website. But in particular, check out their podcast, Waypoint Radio, which has been... you guys somehow managed to become my very favorite gaming podcast over a really, really short amount of time.
Thank you.
Really been doing amazing work there. Great discussions. So for folks who like this show, you'll probably like that one as well. If you aren't already listening to Waypoint Radio, go check it out. So thank you for coming on the show. We'll do a little bit of admin here at the end. I've been Reagan Kelly. You can find me on Twitter at ReaganK. That's RayGank. You can find our show on Twitter at _shortgame, and we love to hear from you there. You can also go to www.theshortgame.net, where we've got a contact form. You can let us know what you're thinking. If you have short games that you think we ought to be checking out or playing, let us know there. Laura, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Laura J. Nash.
And Patrick, where, of course, can people find you and all of your work?
And they can find me at Patrick Klepek.
And thank you so much for joining us on The Short Game.